Sailors of Reddit, what's the most unusual thing you've experienced at sea? Out of a submarine periscope, we saw a fully inflated pink unicorn floaty toy. We were very far from any civilization. That is something that has always gotten to me. Being way out in the open sea, far away from anything, and seeing, sailors will all get this, mylar balloons. I effing hate those things. They're everywhere in the ocean. Everywhere. It's crazy to be a million miles away from any land, and suddenly you'll see a glint off in the distance. Pick up the binoculars and there will be a cluster of balloons floating on the water that is a remnant of someone's birthday party or send-off of their loved one who died. Hey, guess what? You know those messages you want to be sent to the angels? I'm the one who found them. They ended up in a dolphin's gullet. This one isn't me, but a Welsh guy I met in the Caribbean. He had done a few transatlantic trips in a small sailboat, so had tons of ocean experience. A big storm caught him, with huge rolling waves. He decided to heave to ride it out, basically using your sail and the rudder to put the brakes on and give yourself a smoother ride. He was in the cockpit and was riding up one of the bigger waves. The next part is wild. He swears to God on his grandmother's grave that a giant whale just below the surface cruised up the wave beside him and just stared straight at him. He describes looking into the animal's huge eyeball, just looking back at him, for what was probably a couple of seconds, but he said felt like minutes from a few feet away. He's never lied or really even exaggerated otherwise, so I believe him. Can you imagine seeing that? Sometimes I really miss being at sea. Flying Fish timed a wave right and jumped out of the water and threw an open hatch directly into the galley. Freeboard was like 7 meters. The chefs SHAT themselves. How much more ocean to table can you get? I was on a run between California and Hawaii, and I was out on deck doing rounds on deck equipment, checking oil levels, etc. I saw one of those freefall lifeboats just hanging out in the distance. I was like, WTF? I called the bridge. They said a ship accidentally dropped their lifeboat a few years ago, and now it turns up from time to time. Was glad to know no one was on it, but it gave me a brief scare. Being numb to seeing a lifeboat at sea seems like a terrible thing to me. Was sailing off the coast of the big island of Hawaii in February. We were mostly interested in fishing since the wind had died down. There were no other boats around that were visible, and it was a very calm and peaceful day. Now often you'll see humpback whales breaching in February, and you can also hear them singing if you were underwater. That is cool enough, but this encounter was awesome. I was baiting a hook, and suddenly on the starboard side of the boat, a prod of about 20 melonhead whales comes up right beside the boat, and they just start staring us down. I lean over, and this one dude moves a little closer and just keeps moving his head so he can eye me up and down. They all just kept staring at us with an expression of, WTF are these? Whew, interesting. Don't look like they can swim at all. They eyed us at close quarters for about 5 minutes, then just took off. The weirdest part of the encounter was the close eye contact I had with the first whale was definitely two individuals sizing each other up. The best part of the whole day. Lots of crazy little things, but I was on a ship that lost a man overboard in the Atlantic. Reports were that a lifesaver was thrown immediately after he fell in. The lookout said he saw a swell overtake him as he was going toward the lifesaver, and that was it. We searched for hours, never seeing a single sign. Searchlights in the water, dark-shaped swimming past them. Makes you realize how small we are in nature. Still think about it to this day. On my phone, so this is probably not going to do it justice, was gently sailing down the northeast coast of New Zealand, heading into Auckland at about 2 to 3 a.m. I was on watch and the other crew member was asleep below. It was a pitch black night, no moon, and the sea was very still, so as soon as you look overboard, all you saw was black. Eventually you saw stars, but it was impossible to distinguish the sea from the sky. As I was keeping a watch, I saw what I thought was a shooting star, just much bigger. It came again and again until there were about 30 of these shining, glittering trails shooting around the boat. It was very disconcerting, and it took me a few minutes to click what was happening. We had sailed into a patch of luminescence while dolphins were swimming around the boat, planning on both it and our wake. I have not noticed them due to it being so dark. For something so simple, it was a very moving, almost spiritual experience, and it will remain one of my all-time fondest memories. I was US Navy. Pretty sure we heard siren calls somewhere northwest of the Marshall Islands. Was on the smoke deck on 3 separate occasions at night, and anyone who was out there heard what sounded like a distant scream or screech echoing over the waves. I remember it well because it caused several men overboard scares where we'd all have to go muster to make sure those sounds weren't any of ours. Never actually saw anything, so I rationalized that it could have been some kind of animal or seabird, but that stuff sounded human. But not entirely human. We joked for weeks after we left the region that Ariel, the Little Mermaid, was going to kill us. This was 2013, but I still remember that sound like it was yesterday. The kind of sound that hits your core as a freezing wind does. Not something I'd want to hear again. A pirate attack on a ship 5 miles behind us. This happened in the Malacca Strait close to Indonesia about 15 years ago. This place was known for piracy and we had taken our safety measurements. Roll out water hoses, extra lookout, make sure all doors are locked. There was a tangible tension on the ship when all of a sudden, a panicked call came on the emergency channel about small boats approaching quickly. We found the ship on our ECDIS and looked back through the binoculars to see the whole drama unfold. The ship had their hoses spraying water all over. The pirates were randomly shooting at the ship with machine guns. There were 3 boats. One stayed at a distance and the other 2 came in quickly and boarded. There were 2 more panicked calls from the ship and then it went quiet. The ship changed course soon after and I never heard what happened. Also one time a monsoon rain where you couldn't breathe anymore. So dense was the water. And one time in the Indian Ocean where we were surrounded by hundreds of whales for hours and hours. The most beautiful thing I've ever seen. My dad and I rarely tell this to anyone because they laugh it off, but this really happened. We were both sober, awake, and alert, and nothing we could think of in our world can explain it. We were motoring at an anchorage at about 10 p.m. one night. The sea was perfectly still and the waves gently washed against the pebble beach. That was the only sound, apart from the quiet engine noise coming from underneath the floorboards. We both had our heads through the top hatches because it was quite nice weather. All of a sudden, a weird ball of cloud or mist with a faint light in it floats in from out of the night, like just materialized. Hovers for long enough for both of us to see it, pauses, and then just accelerates upwards and away at about a 45-degree angle and completely disappears into the night sky. I SHITU not. That was almost 7 years ago, and we both remember it exactly the same as others. Nothing explains it. As far as I'm concerned, that wasn't something from this earth. I was just offshore from a beach when I spotted 2 dolphins. One of them leaped through the air toward my boat, over and over, at least 10 times. Swim a few feet, jump, swim, jump, repeat like SeaWorld tricks. They continued past my boat toward the beach. I don't know why, but I suspected that there were sharks nearby and perhaps the jumping dolphin was giving a warning. Within a couple of minutes, I saw several large sharks in the area the dolphins came from. Maybe a coincidence, but I never forgot it. I'm telling my partner's story. He's an Atlantic Ocean winter fisherman. He says the most unsettling thing that has happened to him was experiencing the doldrums in winter with fog so thick you can barely see the ocean that is just a few feet over the side of the boat. They are in a 40-foot boat, so easily creamed by any tankers out there. Heavy fog rolls over them and everything just stops. No wind, barely a ripple in the water, and they just sat there watching their radars and whatnot to make sure they weren't in anyone's path and just waited for the fog to lift and the air to keep moving. Another creepy one is a friend who had a man overboard. They were able to hook the guy's clothes with a gaff and were dragging him back on board. Remember, this is winter in the Atlantic Ocean. The boat had to turn around to come alongside the man overboard. He had been in the freezing water long enough that he couldn't move his limbs. The gaff broke and the man fell back into the water. Due to the water in his coveralls and boots, they say he immediately sunk like a rock. In an almost instant, he was gone. Couldn't see him. Couldn't bring his body home to his family. Was in the US Navy on the lookout. Around 2 in the morning, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, I spotted a strange plane that was pink and blue flashing lights. These are not normal colors of plane lights. Control insisted it was a satellite because they couldn't see it on the radar. Was no damn satellite. It was much bigger than any stars around it, the usual size of a plane in the atmosphere. Or some kind of rocket maybe? After a few minutes, it disappeared. No, I don't believe in aliens, but we weren't near any sort of landmass for hundreds of miles. My grandpa was a commercial fisherman on the coast of Oregon. One year I was spending the summer with him fishing, working, saving money for college, as a teen. We had a gray whale lift his 50-foot boat right out of the water and look at us. The eye was right off the port side and was about the size, shape, and color of a football. He reached over and gave it a scratch. It then led us back into the water and went about its day. One of the funniest things I've ever experienced was when I was on deployment in the Persian Gulf. Every day at 2 a.m., a guy would yell out over the radio comms, "Filipino monkey! Filipino monkey! I want to talk to all the ships! Filipino monkey!" After about the third or fourth night, another guy got tired of listening to Filipino monkey and yelled back to shut the F up. Filipino monkey guy started yelling, "Filipino monkey, F your mother!" And the two of them yelled back and forth for an hour or so. On my ship, we couldn't turn it off due to something my ship was doing, so every day we listened to Filipino monkey radio at 2 a.m. Living in a fishing town in the Mediterranean, so I hear a lot of stories during coffee. Some interesting stuff like US fighter jets flying at really low altitudes. But the best story is this one from a really long time ago. So these guys were fishing, and in the middle of the night, they see something on the radar or whatever. The guy goes out and sees nothing. Pitch dark. When they were very near, he goes out, shines a floodlight, and sees an abandoned ship in front of the boat. They do a stupid thing. They radio their mates who meet them with oxyacetylene, etc., and ransack the thing. Then they drag it to port. Looks like seafinders are keepers and they've missed an opportunity to make a lot of money. It stayed anchored in a scrapyard and eventually was sold for metal. My dad had a boat a few years ago and we decided to board an abandoned dive boat that hadn't been touched in years. Wetsuits, spear guns, and everything else you'd associate with being underwater, except any decent dive gear. Probably pillaged years ago, all over the place. It looked like they'd come back from a trip, hung up their wetsuits, stowed their gear, and then just never went back for any of it. Very weird. This past summer, my wife and I watched something crawl in the night sky, something that can be described as a skyworm. It had a halo of shimmery light around it and was similar to a firework that wouldn't go away in the night sky in a remote area over the Mississippi River. We watched it grow and shrink in length for 30 seconds. It was the scariest, most beautiful, and unexplainable memory of my life, and I am so appreciative to share that memory with someone that I deeply love. I was sailing under an air show and a Vulcan came low and slow for a flyby. It went straight over our head before going full afterburners and vertical. As I was watching the plane, another boat upwind of us fell over. As I and my crew sat there laughing as it seemed like a bit of an amateur mistake, our boat just got blown flat. As I stood on the centerboard wondering what on earth happened, you could see a mini tornado surging across the water. It was then we realized we got hit by the jet wash of the plane. French Navy navigator here. Back in 2018, went underway from Toulon on the high sea patrol ship commanded to queuing for a routine patrol. The sea was very rough out of the roadstead, coming from the west, which was completely contradictory to what our weather briefs were indicating. Captain decided to go ahead nonetheless. We took a heading towards the east to enter Hyères Bay. When we entered in the pass, stuff went down. I was outside, starboard wing of the bridge to take bearings when the ship took a 35-degree list on starboard. If I had held my arm out, I would have been underwater. I held onto the compass for dear life because going overboard in that weather would have probably meant death. Needless to say, I pooped myself. When the ship leveled, my boss went out to check if I was still there and ordered me to go below to check how bad the damage was to some of our gear. I went, and when I was at the main deck, the ship took a 43-degree list to starboard. I was then blessed with the horrific sight of a washing machine that was strapped in a room by the hull on port side, punching a hole through the bulkhead and going straight to starboard without touching the deck. Also, a lot of the firefighting equipment, axes, hoses, pumps, was just flying all over the place, with guys from the security department desperately trying to catch it and fasten it. At that point, we had entered the bay and had better weather. We had lost electricity in the bridge and CIC, so the captain decided to wait in the bay for the weather to calm down. When it did the next day, we pulled back into port for repairs. This little escapade resulted in 2 guys having broken limbs, the electrical network of the bridge and CIC being badly damaged, the guys that were supposed to strap down stuff didn't do it correctly and got punished, and for me, a reminder of my mortality. Not a sailor, but one time I was on a cruise ship and a dude fell overboard from the 13th floor, lost at sea forever. Apparently he was drunk and doing God knows what. But the crazy thing is that the cruise ship never stopped or looked for him. It was nighttime in the Atlantic and there was no way you could see him. I think it took a few minutes for anyone to reach a crew member they could alert. By then, he was probably long gone behind us, and they just threw a few flotation devices overboard and called the Coast Guard. You could hear the man overboard alert though once they found out. Looking off the railing of the top floor of a large cruise ship is crazy. I can't imagine falling that far into the water and just being left behind. It was a long while ago in the pitch black night that we were sailing off the coast of Sicilia, and for a brief moment of time, the sky was so bright reddish orange. All of us on the bridge thought hell was raising and we'll all be dead soon. But soon enough, after everything settled, we realized that it was Mount Etna that decided to present us with a light show, and it was so freakishly mesmerizing. I think it was a good start for my career. And also, there were quite unique views you can see in the night. All the stardust glowing over you, or phytoplanktons lighting the route for you. Used to run the Catalina from LA to fish all the time. 26-mile run. Gotta head back by early afternoon or the swells get real big, and in a 26-foot cuddy cabin it gets real tough. Brother and I had a good day out and were catching all kinds of fish and didn't pay attention to the time. Started heading back around 3 p.m. Must have been a storm coming cause the swells were easily 12 feet high. We'd get in between a set and look to either side and there would be a wall of water higher than the top of the sunshade over the helm. Like you gotta look up to see the top of the wall of water on either side of you. Pray the motor doesn't stall, power up the swell, and coast down. Repeat for 2 hours till you're back in the harbor. Good times. Not sailing, but I was snorkeling pretty far out of the coast of Mykonos, Greece. I was looking at some weird-looking sea urchins, and I look out, and probably 20 feet away from me, I see this huge barracuda about 4.5 to 5 feet long. It started swimming towards me. I wasn't too worried about it, but when it got to me, it just kind of swam around me for what must have been 20 seconds, and then it just darted off. I don't know much about their normal behavior, but it was pretty cool to see. And even further in the distance, there was what looked like a huge blackish-brown fish. At this point, my goggles were fogging up, so I don't really know the exact shape, but it was big, and just kind of lingered around a patch of seaweed. After that, I headed back to the boat and warmed myself up because the water there is cold as heck.